here together in London, together with Jon Husband from Canada. You're the author of the Wirearchy idea, or the concept. And I had the chance to meet you here in London, also in the progress of my interview series on what's the progress of the state of social collaboration and digital transformation. So you're a long-time researcher, consultant, and thought leader in this space. What is your statement on where are we standing at in the process of the digital transformation evolution?
Well, thank you, Bjorn, first of all, for interviewing me and renewing our friendship and contact along with David and the people of Agile Elephant. I was here in London speaking at a called the London Learning Technology Summer Forum. And I think it's a very good question. I have a number of thoughts about that. The first thought that I have is very often in my presentations these days, one of my first statements or one of my first slides is these conditions are not going away. This is the way the world is now, hyperlinks, platforms, feeds, notifications, touch screens, and it's the way people work generally. In the last couple of years, there have been some very promising examples or initiatives that have gotten started and I think are spreading quite widely and quite rapidly. That would be Working Out Loud, for example, and also the development and the evolution of communities, community management with communities of employees and customers. So this is a recognition that there are connected ecosystems of information. Your question about digital transformation and the state of collaboration and digital transformation is an interesting one for me because I think, and this would be back to the beginning of getting to know you and the Enterprise 2.0 summits, is that there has been a succession of, let's call them buzzwords, ever since the issues of being hyperlinked together and beginning to work differently started. The first buzzword was Enterprise 2.0, Andy McAfee's book, and there was about 2 or 3 years of a real focus on Enterprise 2.0, but that was a lot about us identifying the issues, selecting collaboration platforms, implementing collaboration platforms. Then the next buzzword, and primarily made fashionable and widespread by the Duchess Group, which no longer exists, it was social business. And that had about a 2 to 3 year lifespan, and it got more and more people to recognize that, again, these connected conditions are here to stay. And now I would call it a buzzword as well, but it's a very, very widespread buzzword. All consulting companies in this space will be paying attention to it, is digital transformation. And I think it's actually quite accurate as a buzzword because the world has gone digital. And it is going to be necessary to transform the way we work towards greater collaboration and cooperation, continuous learning, changes in management style and leadership, changes in organizational design, structure, dynamics, and culture, which I believe are all of the implications of the concept of Wirearchy.
When we are discussing, we are just have been discussed this thing at the Enterprise Digital Summit in Paris about the state of the digital transformation. We always distinguish between 2 different levels of states. One where the projects are aimed for, well, what I would say a high performance organization. So they would play in the existing traditional organization scheme and just want to make it better by a better form of collaboration and work. And the second thing is really then disrupting the business and going really digital, and then also supporting this going digital with a new form of collaboration. What would you say? what is the percentage of companies that are going for the? Or do you first of all do you also see the distinguishment at that point, and also can you resonate with this? And do you, what do you see where the companies on in this field?
Yes, I understand that distinction between companies that are existing and want to improve their performance, optimize, get better, become more efficient, become more effective, and so on, and companies that want to effectively disrupt and transform. I personally think that it's extremely difficult for an existing company to blow itself up and start over, or disassemble itself and reassemble itself in different ways due to networks and connected information flows. And I don't really have any idea as to what percentage. I think there are more and more companies that are going to try that because most areas of human activities are becoming networked or are already networked, and there are examples, you know, year after year now of new entrants to industries, let's say like Uber, like Airbnb, like all sorts of others that disrupt. Also, what's coming that I think is a second and probably much more potent wave of digital transformation will be the arrival and the spread of blockchain architecture into a very wide range of human activities. There's an example, for example, of the MIT Media Lab recently building a blockchain initiative to provide academic certification and credentialing. And you know, you can imagine that being connected to MOOCs, which are massive open online courses, and you know, presenting a real threat to universities as they stand. I also know that here in London, an area called FinTech, which is financial technology, is that the large banks are very, very worried about what blockchain architecture may potentially do to their business. As the same thing, I think, really with insurance companies, with accounting consultancies, with legal services in many, many areas, because with the blockchain architecture and the implementation of platforms and smart contracts, you can cut out the middlemen that are already, you know, the basis of some pretty significant industries. So I think that this is going to be coming, and I don't really know how bigger, mid-sized and bigger existing companies are, to what extent they can incorporate, reinvent, reconstruct themselves.
So therefore you would distinguish between those new kind of disruptive business models running on a digital operating model and the old-fashioned, which is just doing their traditional way in a new format, in a new, more higher performed approach of collaboration.
Yes, generally I would make that distinction, and this relates to some of, you may have read, or some of the people listening may have read of some of the things I've written about Wirearchy. Existing companies have very typically designed the work that's done using core assumptions that come from the industrial era about division of labor, about, you know, different levels in organization, pay scales, and so on and so forth, whereas startups and new companies don't have to try to change the culture that exists. They start from scratch, they build around purpose. Now, of course, as companies scale, and John Cotter has been very articulate about this in a little 6-minute video he has on YouTube called Accelerate by John Cotter, is as you get larger and as you scale, you need to have some kinds of structure and order brought to, you know, various departments, various areas of focus, and so on. But generally, I think the startups can be more nimble. They can start with the idea of a culture that's more adapted to a digitally networked environment. They perhaps can adopt different pay philosophies and pay practices. So I believe it makes it easier for them generally, and it's a generalization, to be more fluid, to be more adaptable, to be more responsive. And of course, if you end up scaling up to several thousand or tens of thousands of employees, that gets different. But what we know is that some of the newer entrants to new businesses and companies have an order of magnitude less in terms of the number of employees, because a lot of the functionalities of the business model are built into the platform that they bring to the game.
You mentioned John Cotter, but he also brought up the idea of urgency that is needed to really have sustainable change. So if we just are aiming for a high performance organization with new forms of collaboration, but don't have a really urgency to change, maybe of an external factor like the digital wave that is coming over us and that is threatening our business model, then the changes are not really sustainable.
Well, I think a lot of people by now will have heard of an acronym called VUCA: volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, and also of the Cynefin framework for complex adaptive systems developed by Dave Snowden. And I would argue that we're increasingly in a more complex world. This is not going to go away, and in fact connected information flows, as they begin to affect more and more businesses, will create more and more complexity, and that gets to be the job of senior management to try to understand, are we in a complex area? And I think that if you're perhaps an existing business that's deciding to focus on high performance, but by optimizing and making better what you already have in place, you might miss some of the complexity that's coming at you, and you might high perform your way right out of business.
Great. Maybe as a last question, so what would you be your final or central recommendation to a project lead? How to well, not start, because a lot of companies have started initiative in this field, but how to go further and improve the initiative?
Well, I guess one of the things perhaps that I'm known for, or what I did was, about 20 years ago, my office was just around the corner here, and I worked for a large human resources and organizational effectiveness consulting company, doing things like competency models, job evaluation, work design. And I would suggest to any company looking towards the future to begin thinking much more deeply about making your work design simpler and more generic, and maybe considering designing work and designing pay philosophies and practices such that you're looking really only at maybe 4 levels of an organization, and making things like pay and performance more generic, more people-centric, so that you're going to be able to be more fluid when you need to make changes, as opposed to having to cut half the workforce, which is not good for morale or for the culture, so that you can, it's like the idea from 25 years ago, brought by Toyota and lean manufacturing, of job enrichment, where you get to, perhaps let people go wider in their jobs as opposed to staying focused on their specialization or in their silo. So I would recommend taking a very hard look at work design and modernizing it for the networked era, because it all revolves around the use of knowledge, basically. And it's an area that most people in human resources and organizational learning and development are reluctant to go. I think we all know that the human resources area is, many people talk about its dire need for transformation, or whether it's losing relevance in this networked era. And I would recommend getting very interested and very deep about looking at the core assumptions of work design and trying to update them for the networked era.
Great. Thank you for the interview.
Thank you.